First of all, as I've tried to do a couple of times already, things that were in the news or otherwise that tie right into our church history. Did any of you see in the news yesterday short snippets of video about the Easter services at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre or the Church of the Nativity in Israel? They were very short this time, but they actually showed them. The one I saw was on, was it Fox? No, it wasn't Fox News. It was the video was by AP, the Associated Press, but it might have actually been on CBS that I saw it. But they were actually showing a Greek Orthodox service at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre with the patriarch there to conduct the services. And it was being conducted in front of the I know it's not working. In front of the edicule, the small building inside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre built over the top of the tomb of Jesus. And of course, I liked one news story. They said, Easter services held at the place where Jesus was buried. But of course, that's not why it was held there, was it? It was held there because if that's the place where he was buried, that's the place where he rose from the dead. But that was poor copywriting by some reporter or editor, one or the other. So that was in the news yesterday. But a couple of other things that struck me over the weekend. One, on either Friday or Saturday in the news, they were talking about the plight of Coptic Christians in Egypt. So this would be the Egyptian Coptic Church. Over the last several days, they've had several of their churches bombed. Quite a number of people have been killed, and the Muslim minority extremist group is being blamed for that. And while we're not Egyptian Coptic, we should feel some sympathy, of course, for anybody that dies under those kind of circumstances, but they're being targeted simply because they're Christians. And while they don't practice a lot of things like we do, the fundamental things they believe about God and Christ and salvation is the same as ours. And so we ought to be sympathetic toward that. And so they had video and blood on the floor and all sorts of things in regard to that. The other one was I saw an advertisement for a movie that's coming out maybe next weekend called The Promise. Have y'all seen that? It's they call it a historical piece or a period piece, and they say based on real, the background events are real. It has to do with what happened between 1914 and 1918 in eastern Turkey and in Armenia, in which the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Ottoman Empire, taking advantage of the beginning of World War I, gathered up Armenian Christians and slaughtered them. I've seen numbers from 600,000 to 1.2 million Christians were executed by the Ottoman Empire, the Turks in particular, as a part of the Ottoman Empire. And interestingly enough, even today, the Turks deny it ever happened. Like some people in Germany deny that the Holocaust ever happened. But the bodies are there. The survivors still live, some of them. Every evidence is that this happened on this massive scale. It's the same kind of things we've been studying about in church history that happened at earlier times in Christian history. And it was happening again to believers, this part the Armenian Orthodox, who because of their faith in Jesus Christ that differed from that of their Muslim countrymen, Islam is supposed to have a sort of a toleration pact in place that says while Christians are not on the same level with Muslims in Muslim countries, they are allowed to exist and with some restrictions allowed to worship and believe as they do. But that was being violated at that time in a very big way. 1.2 million people that starts to put it up in the same category as what happened in World War II in Germany, doesn't it? Where the number is much larger, of course. Although you do need to realize that in Germany, while they often talk about 6 million plus Jews were executed in the gas chambers, over 1 million Christians were also executed. And you seldom hear about that part. Or the fact that many ethnic groups, Polish and others, were in large numbers, regardless of religion, were gathered up and also executed. A total of perhaps as many as 15 million people total executed during the Holocaust. Their only real crime was they were not German. Or maybe I should say blue-eyed, blonde-haired German, because almost all the Jewish people were German by citizenship and lived in that nation for many generations. Well, those three things really stood out to me this weekend. So this movie called The Promise has as its background this gathering up of the Armenians by the Turks and the systematic execution of them in a number of different ways. And it focuses on three people, 2 men and a woman, who are trying to get out, escape. One of them an American, the other two, I guess, Armenian. But okay. Today we want to try to briefly cover what's going on in England and then the shift to America between AD 1600 and 1800. And well, I'm sorry that I can't show you what I'm looking at here. These notes are already up on the website, so you can download them. So take what notes you can from listening to me during this section of the class at least. Maybe I'll try again and again to get it up by the second half of the class today. But, as I said last week, as we're studying this, first we had this very broad scope. But over the last few sessions in particular, that scope is narrowing down. First to Western Europe with the Reformation. And now today we're narrowing it down even further to the Reformation taking place in England. And then the shift of that to America. And if we finish what we have scheduled for today, then on Wednesday we're going to talk about the Great Awakenings and Restoration movement in America. And that'll bring us up to our break for a week. And then when we come back, all of our sessions after the break will be special studies, as I've promised. The development of the canon, persecution in the church, and other things like that. And that's also when we'll start hearing from some of you as you present to us your papers that will fit into that time frame. Okay? All right. What was happening in England during this time? We've already talked about Luther and Calvin, Luther in Germany, which ended up creating a two-church state. And by that I mean there were Lutheran churches and there were Roman Catholic churches. And Germany was broken up into, I should have said two-church nation. Is broken up into a series of states with princes over each one of them. And so each prince decided which of those two churches was going to be the official church of their state. Calvin in Switzerland. The end result of that movement there, that reform movement, was the same thing. Switzerland was made up of what was called cantons, which is probably another idea similar to state. And each canton had one major city in it, and so the ruler of each canton, or the city fathers of the city in that each canton, would decide ultimately whether it was going to be a Reformed church or a Catholic church in that canton. And they may or may not tolerate the other group in there. We had the Huguenots in France. We really didn't talk about them very much. This was the Reform movement, the Protestant movement getting started in France. But they had much more difficulty making headway in France because of the government of France, primarily a king and a queen who were staunch Catholic. And for a while, Protestantism was tolerated during this period, early 15 to mid 1500s in France. but a series of events took place. They're often referred to in history as the French Wars of Religion, in which suppression of the Protestants began in earnest, and it sort of culminated in an event called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, which happened in 1572. And at that point, someone had come to the king and said, the Protestants are plotting an overthrow of the government. And I don't know what evidence was presented. Historians today can't figure out what it was that the Huguenots, as they were called, the Protestants, might have been doing that would have triggered that accusation. Probably only hatred and prejudice on the part of the ones bringing that charge before the king. But the king believed that. And they arranged on a certain day, just within a day or two after those charges were made, that almost instantly soldiers went out throughout the city of Paris and out to the outlying towns, gathering up Protestants and pretty much killing indiscriminately. Anywhere from 3,000 to 10,000 or more Protestants died within a week. Totally unexpected and unprepared for that. And that caused the Protestant movement in France to decline. So that by, just a few years later, in effect, Protestantism had been wiped out for a generation in France. And it still struggles today to find roots in France. It's almost entirely a Catholic nation even today. I'm sure Christoph could tell us more about how difficult it is for non-Catholics to function in the nation of France even today. Then there was the Reformation in the Netherlands. We didn't really mention too much about that last week, but the Netherlands became sort of a haven for a group called the Anabaptists.
Come on.
The Anabaptists started out with some of the teachings of Zwingli, but soon they parted ways with him while he was still alive. They became convinced that infant baptism was not according to Scripture. And the term Anabaptist means rebaptizers. That's literally what their name meant. And they were all rebaptized as adults. And they were sort of a group without a home. They were run out of Switzerland. At times they were run out of Germany. They were run out of other nations. But they found a welcome, a very liberal kind of nation, relatively speaking, just like it is today, in the Netherlands. So many Anabaptists end up settling in the Netherlands, some also into England, and you'll hear about that in a few minutes. So those were the Anabaptists. Also, the Reform movement in the Netherlands happened pretty much without violence and was formed the Dutch Reformed Church, as it was called. And in all these cases, except with the Anabaptists, and of course the Huguenots, these are church and state organizations. These are churches that are connected with the state. And that's an important thing to realize, because when we get to the English Reformation, we're gradually going to start seeing people who want to see a separation between church and state. This period of time from AD 1500 to 1800, and particularly 1600 to 1700, is historically very interesting in Western civilization for a number of other reasons other than church history. In the early 1600s, they had a revolution in England. The king was overthrown. The king was executed. And the military took over. That's something you just wouldn't expect out of the English during that period of time. But beyond that is also the time that's often referred to as the beginning of the Enlightenment, where in educational circles, separate from religion, there were rising up these men who were putting forth ideas that we can know about the world around us and the universe based upon reason and using our own senses. And eventually that evolved to the point where they said we can only know about the world around us through reason and our own senses. And where do you think that leaves something like revelation from God? And where do you think that leaves something like the existence of God? It leaves those out. They weren't atheists, but eventually that movement will lead in the direction of a godless science and a godless philosophy that still dominates Western culture today, and educational circles in particular. But it starts during this period of time. And of course the church didn't help their cause any by executing a man named Copernicus. I believe they executed him because he was the first actually to suggest that the earth revolves around the sun instead of the other way around. And of course that was then picked up by Galileo with his telescope, and his observations of the heavens firmly convinced him that the earth is not the center of the solar system, much less the whole universe, but that the sun is at the center of the solar system, and that our solar system is just part of something much larger than it. But the church, of course, accused him of heresy and threatened him and jailed him and so forth, and trying to, arguing on theological grounds that couldn't be so. And of course, none of us today, I don't think, would subscribe to the church's position at that time. But so it was a very interesting time. We still have this middle class rising up. We talked about that again last time, how more and more people were moving up from a peasant level up to a middle class, merchant, workers, and others. More and more people were getting an education. Illiteracy in most of the Western countries was starting to decline. And printing press was making things available for them to read. And Bibles were being printed, and even if you got one at the risk of your life, they were available. So more and more people in the church and in the Reformed movement as well were reading the Bible. The Catholic Church issued several statements during this period of time. Sorry I didn't write one of them down, but basically, as the Reform began, the Catholic Church said, see, this is what happens when you let everyone read and interpret the Bible for themselves. And they had a point. Suddenly you have all these different groups forming. Everybody reading the Bible for themselves did not create one uniform other church besides the Roman Catholic Church. It instead produced a whole abundance of religious groups, not only differing from the Catholic Church, but differing from each other. And all of them claiming that it was based upon what they were reading in Scripture. And that's a very interesting thing to contemplate, because that sort of eventually sets the stage for our own restoration movement, where the plea was, let's be united on what the Scriptures say. Not be divided because we feel like we understand them differently than each other. Well, how's the Roman Church going to respond to this? This is what we haven't talked about yet. Scholars have variously labeled this time from 1500 to into the early 1600s as either the Catholic Counter-Reformation, in other words, a counter to the Reformation of the Protestants, or just the Catholic Reformation. There were several things the church began to do. It was spread out over time, but they were all responses to this reform movement that's going on. First was the blessing of the beginning of several new orders of men and women in the church. The sort of the foot soldiers of the church had been, ever since the Benedictines, monks and friars and nuns. They were usually the ones who did the evangelism. They were often the teachers in small communities where maybe there wasn't enough priests to make it out there, and so often a monk or a friar would be the one tasked with trying to teach the gospel and educate people. But several new groups were started up. One group was called the Theatines. Theatines. The Theatines were mostly made up of more aristocratic, that is, well-to-do Catholic men who basically had independent means of living. They didn't have to depend on working for a living because the order they created, the Theatine order, did not beg for money, did not ask the church for money. They existed economically independently. But that's because the men were paying out of their own pockets, and they were well enough to do that. And they emphasized going and building chapels in places where there were not church buildings. Chapels were sort of mini church buildings where people would come and worship. And so part of the thought was that there were many areas that the church, by that I mean the Roman church, did not have churches and priests. And so let's go in and let's build a chapel there, and then one or more of us will serve these people by conducting worship services, have the liturgy, educate them in the gospel, catechize them in the fundamentals of the faith, and so forth. That was the Theatines. Then there was I believe it's pronounced the Capuchins, Capuchins, the Capuchins. It was a part of the Franciscans, actually, but it's what looked to me like sort of a restoration movement among the Franciscans. Realize the Franciscans had dated back, 500 or 600 years to St. Francis of Assisi, who had laid out a simple form of life and a simple form of service for those who were going to be a part of his order. And at first the Franciscans very much followed that and still did follow it more in lip service than in actual practice by the 1500s. So the Capuchins were some Franciscans that basically said, let's go back to the original form. And while they stayed in the Franciscan movement, they were separate. They emphasized extreme austerity, poverty, and simplicity of life. And that was in imitation of Francis of Assisi himself. The Ursulines, 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 was a women's movement. Basically, we would say nuns. It was a women's order for the education of girls and women in the church. Often they were left out in the overall education process of the church. So they started educating women specifically, along with having a ministry of care for the sick and the needy. And then the largest of these groups, and the fourth one we mentioned, is the one's called the Jesuits. Jesuits, the Jesuits. The present Pope is a Jesuit. In fact, he's the first Pope from the Jesuit order. The Jesuits were also called the Society of Jesus. The Society of Jesus. They were founded by a man by the name of Ignatius Loyola. He was a former military man who had been wounded and disabled in military action in Spain, and had a sort of not an aha moment so much as a conversion experience and effect, believing that God wanted him to change his life and to lead others to do the same. So they were based on chastity, that is, celibacy, poverty, evangelism, education, and the last one's the most important, total, unquestioning obedience to the Pope. Having been formed by a military man, in the years since have often been referred to as God's soldiers or God's Marines. They were the ones they wanted the Pope to feel confident that he could send in to any situation and ask them to do anything necessary on his behalf. And so that's what they were known for. Most of the time, fortunately, the things they did we'd find commendable. Education, helping others, being the face of the church out in the community. They didn't hide behind monastery walls. They were often out there in the public and a part of public life. I know right now a man who's a Jesuit from the Philippines, that he's a prominent man in the IT area, that is, technology. He does a lot of work for the Jesuits and their websites and other things, but more than that, he is out there in the community, and he often appears on shows and gives interviews and gives demonstrations, and but he always has that his collar on. He's always wearing black, and he's always introduced as Father Robert, and he's a Jesuit. That was the idea behind that. But at times, of course, they got involved with things like the Inquisition in Spain, in which people were actually accused of being heretics and then even executed for that, and the Jesuits were a part of that as well. So that's one thing the church did. New orders, new religious orders or groups. A second thing that the church did is they started to put a greater emphasis upon using art as a way of teaching the church the fundamentals of the church's teaching and doctrines. Of course, a large number of the church members were still illiterate. The cathedrals somewhat acted in that capacity in the places where they existed. I don't know if you realize that, but when a fellow from the stick, so to speak, out in the outback of a country where maybe there was just a small little church building where he was at, and they had a priest and they had the liturgy and the mass and all that. When he came into town, like to Paris or to Hamburg or wherever it was, and he saw the cathedral there, it was like, nobody will believe me when I go back home and tell them what I'm seeing here. Because not only were they massive, but they were reaching up to heaven, and all over the outside of it was carvings and statues of biblical and church-related individuals and themes. And when you went inside, the beautiful, huge stained glass windows telling the story of the Bible or the martyrdom of saints and statues. And when the worship took place, it just sounded like, he thought, like what it would sound like in heaven when the singing was going on. One of the things that the cathedrals were designed to do was to educate the illiterate in the church. And now the church is going to extend that, and they start commissioning artwork to be done. Men in particular, but not just men, women as well sometimes were commissioned to do statuary, to do paintings. Think Sistine Chapel. And what's going on there. That was an early form of that. But what you're doing is you're using art, something everyone was drawn to, whether they could read or not, that told a story. And so a whole new style of art sprang up from the church during this time called the Baroque form of art. Baroque, I believe it is. Baroque art, and you can go look it up sometime. It's a very distinct form of painting and artistry. And it saw its heyday during this period of time, and it was all being funded and fueled by the church. It also went beyond just paintings and art. It also involved architecture and sculpture as well. So new orders, new art, new music. The church gradually during this period of time changed in many of the churches their style and content of music. Now still the music was not being sung by the congregants, but it was being sung by the choirs or by groups of monks or nuns and so forth. But they updated and simplified the kind of music, and some of it started to be sung in the native language of whichever country they were in. so the congregants could actually understand it. And they were using music to teach. Remember, the reason music stopped being sung by the whole congregations in the late 400s was, as the church said, heretics are using this to teach people. So we're going to eliminate...
He don't believe you.
So we're going to stop allowing congregants to sing to eliminate that. But now suddenly that's coming back around, but going the other way. Now the church itself says we're going to teach our members the theology and faith of the church through music. And so that was a big thing. Perhaps, though, the biggest single thing, number 4, so orders, art, music, but the biggest thing was actually the calling of a council called the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563. This group met for 18 years. Not full time. And it wasn't a ecumenical council in that bishops from everywhere came to it, but a select group that the Pope assembled. They met for 18 years to consider everything from how to resolve the financial abuses that were going on in the church to how to address more adequately the immorality that was going on among some of the clergy in the church, ways to reform the organization of the church to make it more efficient and effective. They even decided that the church needed a Bible. Now, they've been using, of course, Jerome's Vulgate Bible for since 405, so that means 1,100 years by this time. And so during the 18 years of this Council of Trent, they approved the adding of the what's called the Deuterocanonical, the extra biblical books into the Old Testament. Some 15 additional books were added to the Old Testament. Translated into Latin, they cleaned up the Latin of Jerome a little bit since it was about 1,100 years out of date. And the point of fact that except in the church, nobody in the world was even speaking Latin anymore. But nevertheless, they cleaned up the Latin. They added 15 additional books, and they issued the Vulgate Bible as the Bible for the churches to use. That was all by the Council of Trent. At the same time, they affirmed all the fundamental doctrines and practices of the church. They just were trying to address the abuses that the Protestants were making hay over and was causing people to leave the church because of those abuses. But over the fundamental things, the priesthood, transubstantiation, salvation through the receiving of the grace of God through the 7 sacraments, all of those are reaffirmed. They wanted Catholics to know these things were not negotiable. But these other things, we are trying to address and solve these problems. And so this was called the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. Very important, and I think really pretty impressive that the church responded that way. For 200 years or so, the church had just persecuted those who said the church had a problem. But now finally, at last, the church is admitting we've got some problems and we need to address them. However, the Reformation movement, the Protestant movement, was already well underway, and it was not going to be stopped at this point. So now that brings us to what's going on specifically in England. We talked some last time about John Knox up in Scotland. Scotland was separate from England and yet a part of it. I never have understood exactly what the relationship was. They had their own king or queen separate from the one down in England. And yet during this period of time, we're going to start seeing both kings and queens who are king and queen of both. In fact, King James, from which we get the name for the King James Bible, he was King James VI of Scotland. About 15 or 16 years before he ever became King James I of England. And while he was King James I of England, he continued to be King of Scotland as well. So things are happening a little different over in England. So what happens in England? First, we have to go back before 1600. The Reform movement first shows up in England in some very visible way with King Henry VIII. This king that was married, but his wife was not able to give him an heir to the throne. I think the only child she ever had that lived beyond childbirth essentially was a girl. And so he goes to the Pope and says, I need this marriage annulled so I can marry another wife that can give me male heirs to the throne. And the Pope said no. And King Henry VIII said, well, I think it ought to be annulled because, you know, she was married to my brother first. And then when he died, I married her. And so I really shouldn't have married her in the first place. A little late, you know, for that. But and the Pope still said no. And so with the advice of council, some of the men that advised the king during that time, and I think he even had the Archbishop of London, who was supposed to be a staunch Catholic, actually gives him advice that, you know, let's just declare that, you know, the Catholic Church in England is an English church, not a Roman church. And so in 1531, Henry VIII declared that the church in England, the Roman church, the Catholic Church in England was breaking away from the Holy Roman Catholic Church. Well, of course, the Pope condemned him as a heretic and other things, but there wasn't much else the Pope could do. The country mostly went with Henry on that, or if they didn't have any means of expressing their disapproval anyway, because he was the king.
You say that's 1531?
1531 is when the break is usually dated as taking place. And it's about this same time, maybe shortly before this, that King Henry had William Tyndale hunted down and burned at the stake for having translated the Bible into English and having it printed.
Wow.
About 2 years after he broke with Rome, he had his scholars take Tyndale's English Bible, redecorate it a little bit, update it a little bit, and issue it
That's the new Bible.
as a new English Bible for all the churches in England to use. Now, all the churches in England at that time meant all the English Catholic churches. There weren't any other kinds yet in England. So it was a complete flip-flop on his part.
Wow.
No doubt he would argue that he'd killed Tyndale because that's what the Pope wanted to do. And now as head of his own church, he saw the benefit of the church having a good English Bible, not a Catholic Vulgate Bible in every pulpit. And this Bible was called the Great Bible. That's the expression that was used for it, the Great Bible, mostly because of the size of it. I've seen pictures of a few of them. They're gigantic. They make these coffee table Bibles that some people have today, you know, the big oversized family Bibles, look minuscule by comparison. These were gigantic Bibles. And, of course, they were only intended to be kept in the church and not moved or anything like that. In 1547, Henry passes away, and that's his reign is a whole story in and of itself. You even have a popular pop music song back from the 70s. Who was it that did Henry VIII I Am? Whoever that was, Paul Revere and the Raiders maybe, or the Monkees. Those were the two groups I listened to the most, but most of you guys says who, what? Yeah, sorry. But that was a popular song for a while. I think reached number 1 in the 70s. When he passes away, his son, King Edward VI, takes the throne. 1547 to 1553, only king for about 5 to 6 years. He was only 10 years old when he became king. And died of natural causes, as far as we know, about 6 years later. So because he was in his minority, that is, not considered an adult yet, a lot of the running of the country was done by those around him, including during this period of time, the English Catholic Church, as I'm calling it now, gradually ends up being called the Church of England, or even later the Anglican Church. Anglican from Angle is just, the old word for English, the English Church. Some of those around him quickly pushed for the Anglican Church to become more Protestant and less Catholic, because under Henry, except for the Bible, everything else about the church has stayed pretty much the same. Clerical celibacy, practicing of the Mass, the same structure for the church with archbishops, bishops, priests and all of that, monasteries, all of those things. But they started pushing it in the direction of the Reform movement. And one of the things that was done during this time was the adoption of what was called the Book of Common Prayer. This was the book that guided what happened every week in the church services. And instead of using the Roman or Catholic Book of Common Prayer, a new one was put out by a man by the name of Thomas Cranmer, and I believe he was the archbishop during this time. And it was in English, not Latin. And it led the churches in England to start conducting their services in English, as well as have an English Bible. And it did confirm some other changes as well. During his, that is, not the Book of Common Prayer, but the changes made by the counselors to the king during this time, they gave their blessing to clerical marriage instead of celibacy, and for the Mass to be conducted in English instead of Latin. Well, of course, that would go along with the Book of Common Prayer, which was in English as well. But the king passed away at age 15. And he apparently was a little bit more precocious than most 15-year-olds are today, because even leading up to his death, he was having quite a conflict with his half-sister, who was older than he, but of course she was further down the line of accession to the throne. But when he passed away through a series of manipulations and some people in right places, they bypassed the will of King Henry VIII. He had left, in effect, in his will, here who should succeed me after I die. Of course, first of all, his son, and then after that he had somebody else, and somebody else after that. Well, Mary was way down the list. Mary, Tudor. She became queen. And she was staunch Catholic. She had refused to worship in her father's private chapel once it became the Anglican Church. She had her own chapel, which was still Roman Catholic. She immediately, after becoming queen, reaches out to the Pope and says, "What do we need to do to reunite with you?" And a process began of reuniting the Anglican Church with the Roman Church. At the same time, she started removing from her government people who would not take a pledge of allegiance to her and to the Catholic Church. She also started removing from churches throughout England clerics who had married. I think over 3,000 were forced to resign. Many of them jumped at the opportunity once they were told they could marry to marry. And then 2 years later, they're all told they're without jobs now, as we go from King Edward to Queen Mary. And over 300 Protestants, mostly leaders in the churches, were arrested and executed during her reign. Her reign only lasted 5 years. She died unexpectedly in 1558, so she reigned from 1553 to 1558. But meanwhile, the church had moved back towards reuniting with the Roman Church. Following her was her half-sister. Remember, Henry VIII was married 6 times, I believe it was. And he had children by several of those wives, and only one of them was a boy. The others were girls. But when Mary passed away, Her half-sister, who she had had jailed for the last year of her reign, became the new Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth I. The present Queen of England is named after her. Queen Elizabeth I. She immediately moved to reestablish the independence of the Church of England and further established that its doctrine would be not Catholic but Reformed. In other words, the Church of England adopted more, not all of, but more of basically Calvinism as their doctrine under her. Meanwhile, its governance, that is the order, the arrangement of the offices, and there remained as they were, pretty much Catholic in style, but the doctrine was shifting and the practice. There were some in the church who started urging her to go even further in her changes, but her statement was over and over, I am trying to strike a great middle ground between the extremism of Protestantism we see on the continent and Roman Catholicism. So she is trying to strike this middle ground. Those who urged her to go further were called by several different names. They were called, of course, dissidents. They were called nonconformists because they didn't agree with where the church was. But the name that probably stuck the most is they were called Puritans. And that they were trying to purify the church in removing all the, as they thought of it, evil from Catholicism from it. They wanted to purify it, and so they were called Puritans. And they arose and were clearly identified as a different group during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. Fortunately, she reigned a good long time, and that brought some stability to the nation and to religion in England. She reigned from 1559 to 1603. And at her passing, and she passed away as unmarried. She never married, so she was the Virgin Queen. And because she didn't have any children, then there was no heir to the throne from her. And so at her passing, and with her blessing before she'd even died, they then looked up to Scotland, to King James VI up there. A member of the royal family, but rather remotely kin. And he is named the new King of England, King James I, in 1603. By all accounts, he was mostly a good king, good foreign policy, good economics, probably better economics for the country than Elizabeth had. She tended to practice a lot of, what are some of the words to use that would be nice, but get the idea across. She tended to let people establish monopolies in areas. Even if they were not the best ones to be doing that one thing, they would have the total, complete contract from the government for this thing or that thing. And she wasn't very good at taxation. Here they were moving into this Enlightenment period, and they're right into the modern world almost, and yet they were still using an antique tax collection system that she did nothing to fix. So most of the taxes that could have been collected weren't. And some of the ones that were probably were taken by extortion from people who really didn't know that much. But James started trying to fix a lot of those things. Shortly after he became king, because there were those who thought someone else should have ended up being king other than him, a plot was discovered, and it was linked to the Catholics. There was actually a plot to bring in large barrels of gunpowder into the Parliament building, at least according to the theory. And when Parliament was meeting and when the king had arrived to address the Parliament, they were going to set off these barrels of gunpowder and kill the king and wipe out the Parliament all at once. And it's called, in history, it's called the Gunpowder Plot. Well, after this was discovered, this sort of turned the king a little bit away from that middle road that Elizabeth had had before him. It turned him away from the Catholics. He forced all Catholics in the nation to take an oath of allegiance, not to him, but to the Church of England, that they would not look to the Pope as their ultimate authority in religious and civil matters, but to the Church of England instead. And if they would not take that oath of allegiance, they could not hold office. They could not hold public office. They could not be officers in the military. There were many business opportunities that would be closed to them, many educational opportunities that would be closed to them if they would not take this oath of allegiance. Puritans, who thought he should go even further, started being persecuted by government authorities just like the Catholics were. He wanted everybody to conform to this one standard. The Catholics needed to come from their side into this. The extremist Puritans needed to come back from where they were into this. And so the Puritans were persecuted under James almost as much as the Catholics were. Finally, a meeting was held in which they tried to resolve some of this, especially meetings with the reforming element of the Anglican Church. And several things were approved, and he approved of doing them that he thought they would bring about some peace. But one of the things that was decided, let's get a new English Bible. I mean, because all we have by now is the Tyndale Bible, the Great Bible, and the Geneva Bible. Surely we need a new Bible by now. And there was really some good reasons for that. But this was supposed to be a Bible that corrected some of the poor translations that took place in the earlier ones, some of those translations supporting certain points of view that didn't agree with King James, or he didn't agree with them. And so he commissioned a group of scholars to produce a new translation. They had a very short time schedule to do it in. So they began with the translation by Tyndale, and then started comparing his translation with the original Greek and Hebrew, and made changes to his where it was appropriate, and that became the first version of the authorized King James Version of the Bible. It wasn't a fresh translation. It was a big upgrade probably from Tyndale, but it was not actually a new translation. And it was called, not in their own time, but in later times, the Authorized King James Version, because it was authorized by King James. Not necessarily by God, but by the king. And it was published in 1611. At first, it was not well received by the public, but over time, since it had the government behind it, it grew on people, so to speak. And so probably by the late 1600s, it was the number one English Bible in England.
When was it first published? I'm sorry.
1611. And it went through several major revisions, all the way up until the 1700s. The form of the King James we have today is a form that was the revision that was made in the early 1700s, somewhere around 1720, 1715, 1720, somewhere in there. And well, it should, when you're translating from one language to another, scholarship advances, knowledge increases, you can see improvements that need to be made. And so that's what he's mostly known for, is, of course, the authorized King James Bible. It is interesting to note a couple of these earlier Bibles, the Geneva Bible, which you ought to be able to tell by the name, Geneva, that it was put out by the Reformers in England, an English Bible. It had two unique things about it. It was the first English Bible that had two things. Number one, it was actually broken up into not just chapters, but verses. Earlier English translations were not. They were broken up by book, of course, and by chapter, but they didn't have the verse markings in them. But the Geneva Bible actually had the verse markings like we're used to today. That was using a system that was developed a long time before then, but they just hadn't printed in the Bibles. But the second thing is it was the first study Bible. It actually had cross-references. It had dictionary, basically a dictionary part to it where it had definitions and explanations. It had maps in it. Much like we would think of a modern study Bible, but this was in the Geneva Bible. produced by the reformers in England in the English language. Okay, well, that was King James. We're going to talk about what happened when King James dies in 1625.